Okay, I hope you all can hear me. I'm going to get started now. Do let me know if you can't hear me. Post a question if people can or can't hear me. So let me just make sure that I'm sharing my screen. So let's see. I'm Rob Barth. I'm sure many of you know me. I am a Microsoft 365 architect. I've done nothing but Microsoft 365 now and SharePoint before it for more than a decade. So I come from actually quite a technical background. So you might think it's a bit strange that I'm presenting on, I guess, to the IRMS and have moved so heavily into the IRMS. And that's primarily because over the last 5 years or so of my career, I've done pretty much nothing apart from information management. I've moved more exclusively into information management over the past 5 years, specifically into records management. You know, working on some of the larger records management solutions inside Microsoft 365, certainly for UK government, etc. And I'm really delighted to actually be able to speak to you today, not just because I want to speak to you about Microsoft 365 classification. I always intended to actually pop over, but obviously physically getting over to Ireland at the moment isn't the easiest thing, and it's probably best for everyone to stay safe and locked down. But I'm also recently stepped up, only a few weeks ago actually, about 2 or 3 weeks back, as the IRMS's new digital director. So effectively I'm overseeing the website, yes I know, and all of the other functionality provided to you by the IRMS. Now, I don't know how many people here today are already members of the IRMS, but if you're not, I strongly urge you to join. I know I'm biased because I'm now in the exec, but there's a reason I'm in the exec, and that's, for me, the IRMS provide exceptional value to our members. Genuinely, for the amount of money it costs for a membership each year, you get access to a significant volume of information, both in all of the different events that are run up and down, in different regions and in different special interest groups, both physically, once we can get back to physical events, and also via webinars. And of course, also through the website and through various other sort of online resources that we've got access to, the YouTube channel, and the physical publication magazine bulletin that we send out to members as well. So honestly, if you're not a member already, check out the membership options. So in today's webinar, what I'm hoping to do is speak to you about the subject of Microsoft 365 classification. And I'm going to start off with some of the concepts that you might be more familiar with, certainly those people who have already spent some time looking at Microsoft 365 and especially SharePoint and SharePoint Online. And I'll move through to some of the newer features that are coming along. And hopefully there'll be something for everyone as part of today's presentation. Now, let's just get the slide kicker working. Just bear with me a second. Hopefully this will work. Not quite. Physical clicking it is then. Right. So some of you are probably looking at the screen and wondering why on earth I've put up a picture of a bunch of stone tools when I'm here to talk about technology in Microsoft 365. Well, the simple answer to that is that these are actually Clovis points, and they're actually they're about 14,000 years old, give or take 1,000 years or so, and they're created in the Mississippi River Basin. I can hear there's a couple of questions coming on, and effectively, good to hear that people can hear me. Thanks for that, James. These Clovis points are effectively, the reason I'm bringing them up is that they're the name of a tool that defines a culture. So we have given almost an arbitrary name, the word Clovis, to define an entire society in the past. We have effectively given that society a classification. And the name itself has nothing to do with the people in the past. The people of the Mississippi Basin 13,000 years ago would not have referred to themselves as Clovis people. They would not have heard the term. They would not have understood it. It's actually just because the name of a town where we first happened to dig these specific types of stone tools up happened to be called Clovis, and that town itself was probably named after one of the early French kings. So what's happened here is we've given an arbitrary classification onto these tools, and that classification really is because it's been created because we need it. We can't go around constantly talking about that society that was about 13,000 years ago in the Mississippi Basin that made those distinctive pointy tools. We need to have a sensible way of classifying and communicating that basically has shared synonyms, etc., so that we can all understand and understand each other consistently. And so I guess this gets to the point of almost the fundamental purpose of classification. To me, it boils down to those 3 bullet points on the left-hand side. You either classify to group things together, or of course to differentiate them apart. You classify to signify some property, some value about the importance or lack of whatever you are classifying. And of course, you classify to help people discover or to find that particular thing that you're looking for. So whether we're talking about information, the content that we discover, to me, or whether you're talking about something, for example, like an ancient society, like just helping people discover where there's a good food source, or signifying properties of a berry that might be poisonous, for example, we have had different classification that sort of permeated our language over thousands of years, and really it stems today into the very things that we do on a daily basis. Because to me, much of information management almost all stems back to getting the classifications right. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about archival or retention, or whether you're talking about physical records, or whatever you're talking about. Getting classification correct is almost the backbone of everything. It's the way that we almost separate and understand that different actions need to be provided onto different types of content. And I guess if something falls outside of those 3 groupings, it probably is a good example of where we shouldn't be classifying or where we shouldn't be applying metadata. So I've got an example here of a drop-down list. And this drop-down list is actually a real drop-down list that I saw once when I was going into I'm not going to name the organization, but a major company that's a household name. I'm assuming it's a household name in Ireland as well. It certainly is over here. And advertises on TV and that sort of thing. But I went into this organization, and they had a sea of classification, a sea of metadata on their files. In fact, you had to scroll. It was more than a page of metadata you had to fill in every time you uploaded a file into the system. And one of the drop-down lists was this. It was a priority drop-down list with numbers 1 to 5 as the options you could select. And I started going around the team and speaking to different people in different corners of the office. And of course, invariably, some people were telling me that priority 1 was the top priority, and other people were telling me priority 5. This is a perfect example to me of with classification gone mad. We need to know that too much metadata is genuinely too much. If it doesn't fall into those 3 things down the left-hand side, grouping, signifying, or discovering, and helping to actually improve the processes that surround a piece of content, then effectively it's very easy for people to fall into the trap of just applying metadata for the sake of it. I'd suggest that, just as a rule of thumb, less is more, and getting it right is really highly advisable. Just think about every piece of metadata you're applying and make sure it has a real function and a real purpose. So let's actually look then at Microsoft 365 and specifically SharePoint Online in this case, and just look at some of the simpler concepts that I'm sure many of you are familiar with of metadata inside Microsoft 365. Well, what we're looking at here is a fairly standard document library, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. You have a whole series of items, and you apply metadata to those items. And that metadata is called, it's called site columns when you're talking about SharePoint and SharePoint Online. And it's actually quite an easy sort of concept for most people to understand. You can see all of the metadata that's being applied to the content, and it's really powerful because you can use it for searching and filtering and getting different ways of seeing the same information, so that different people can almost cut and dice instead of being restricted to the same structure of folders like you might be on a file share. It's very powerful actually when used right. And as you can imagine, these columns of information really can be used in lots of different ways. So you've got lots of different types of column types behind the scenes. I'm not going to go through all of these. That would be incredibly dull. I think most of them speak for themselves. But you can obviously imagine how the way you store and present, for example, a date has to be different from the way you present, for example, the ability to say yes or no to a particular topic. But when you build them all up, you can end up with some really powerful architectures of classification being built out of just SharePoint metadata. Whether that metadata is being applied to documents and files, or whether it's being applied to list items. In other words, a list item in SharePoint is really just almost the metadata itself without an attached item that's been uploaded. Now, out of all of these on the screen, the one that I think to me is by far the most useful and the most interesting is managed metadata. And I'm sure many of you will already be using managed metadata inside your own environments. And I think it's just worth drilling into that and just taking a closer look. You see, managed metadata effectively provides you with a hierarchical mechanism for creating consistent classification inside SharePoint and SharePoint Online. And it's been with us for a long time. In fact, it was first introduced, I believe, in SharePoint 2010. I haven't looked that up. Someone might correct me in the comments. But when it was introduced, I think it was quite groundbreaking and revolutionary. And it still is to a certain extent. It's still a really powerful way of defining the metadata in one central location and being able to use the same consistent metadata throughout all of your different SharePoint sites. And in fact, the architecture, the way that SharePoint Online has evolved over the last few years, where it's sort of become flatter and you've got a lot more sites and a lot less hierarchy in the actual structure of the sites themselves, especially with concepts like teams, where you've got flat teams with SharePoint sites behind them, almost with no hierarchy. They're incredibly flat. Managed metadata really gives you a central way of making sure there's consistency across all of those different sites and teams. So I love it, and I still use it on almost all of the projects that I get involved with, much to many of the developers I work with, thanks, because it's not the easiest things to develop against. But effectively, the structure inside managed metadata is a bit like this. You have groups inside your term store. And those groups are great. You can use them to separate sort of different projects or applications, or you can use them, I've used them quite a lot to separate different parts of my taxonomy to different parts of the organization. It doesn't stop people from other parts of the organization from using each other's taxonomy. It just allows me to delegate the management to a given group. So for example, here, the knowledge management group might well have permissions delegated to a local person who can manage just the terms inside that knowledge management group, but they can't, for example, add terms into other term sources and term sets that are outside of that group. So inside a group, you have a whole series of term sets. And effectively, each term set, you could almost imagine it as almost a different bit of metadata, a different column. So you might have one for geography, and you might have one for, I don't know, in this case, we've got components. And you can see that inside your term set, you have a whole structure of terms, and terms can be nested underneath other terms. In fact, you can go up to 7 levels deep of terms inside terms. And that gives you an incredible amount of flexibility in building really powerful hierarchies that can be applied then to content, because of course the terms that you're seeing at the bottom there can be made available across different SharePoint sites for tagging. Now, I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to, but you might notice there's a few different icons in the middle there. You've got risk and compliance services, etc. Those are effectively just showing some of the other features that you've got available in managed metadata. They're actually reused terms. In other words, they've been created in a different term set and they're being reused in the components term set. You don't have to worry about that, but effectively the benefit is if they're changed in the parent, wherever they've come from, the change will reflect wherever you've reused the same term, which is really powerful. One other thing I'll mention while I'm here is that you've got the ability with terms, really nice, tidy way of sort of deprecating terms that I love. On each term, you've got the ability to make it available for tagging or not. And by default, it's available for tagging, but there's nothing to stop you from taking a term and saying, no, this is no longer available for tagging. And what that means is the term still exists. It's still tagged to your files, and you can still search for it, and you can still classify by it. You just can't add new content to that particular classification, which I find particularly useful. Anyway, manage metadata. If you're not already using it, I would recommend taking a very strong look at it, because it's core to classification, certainly inside both SharePoint on-premise and also SharePoint Online. Now, how it works from a user experience is it's a bit like a drop-down list. When you click into the actual cell, you see all of the items starting to be displayed, a bit like a scrollable drop-down list, as you can see there. Now, if you click on the tag in the, you see the little tag icon on the right-hand side, you would actually be, it pops up a dialog, and you can see in that, you can browse through the entire hierarchy if you want to view it that way. But I think most people find it easier just to click into the cell and then start typing the name of the actual term that they're looking for, and it will automatically just give you a short list, and you can making it very easy to select the relevant term. So the reason I'm showing you this is primarily because managed metadata works a lot easier from a user perspective, in my opinion, than say a drop-down list. And the reason for that is, well, perhaps a good example I always give is perhaps less relevant in the Republic, but certainly over here in the UK, I always find it very frustrating whenever I'm going to a website and I'm asked to find my country, because invariably I scroll all the way to the bottom of the drop-down list to find invariably that it's not stored under UK for some odd reason. Then I've got to guess, oh, is it GB, or is it someone put it under England? So I end up scrolling up and down this great big long list of items, and frankly, drop-down lists with too many items in them just aren't particularly easy for people to navigate. I find managed metadata, most people get it and find it much easier because it's sort of a search-driven drop-down list. Now, I just wanted to show you an application of this. This, on the left-hand side, you see the refiners section here. What you're seeing here is the ability to refine a search by managed metadata. So, for example, the document team owner and the security classification are examples here of managed metadata that's been tagged onto content. And in this screenshot that I'm showing you, I've searched for the word service, and I've then refined that search to reduce the number of results that are showing to only show me the confidential items. Just to show you one practical application of how this can be used. And of course, if you're using managed metadata, you can have consistent metadata across multiple SharePoint sites and teams. And then when you're building a search such as this, you end up with a much cleaner and more consistent interface. I can hear a question. I'm just going to skip back and have a look. You're quite right. You're quite right. So I'll try and answer this question live. You're quite right. Modern search does not allow refining by metadata. So that was the question that I'm answering, or sorry, that I've been asked. What you're looking at here is actually not modern search. What you're looking at here is actually some patterns and practices team modern search web parts, which were only introduced about a year ago, and they've been steadily improved. So these are third-party sort of open source free web parts you can all use. They're available online, and it allows you to effectively build the traditional search interface that you used to have in classic SharePoint using modern. Now, at the moment, you've got to link these, let's say, under an advanced search link, and you can't link your, for example, you see it says search the site at the top here. You can't link the default location yet to point at these advanced search web part pages, but that's coming. So very soon you'll be able to be in a situation where you can change where the search this site, for example, at the top there, directs its search results to, so that you'll be able to point at an advanced search page and actually then have the refiners back in place. So if you're looking for these, I'd recommend Googling PNP, patterns and practices, modern search web parts. And genuinely, I think they're brilliant, and they're free. Right, you mark that as done answering. And this would work with Evergreen. Well, I'll answer that question while I'm started. Yes. So in terms of Evergreen, of course, as Microsoft 365 keeps evolving, the patterns and practices web parts keep evolving too. So the team, let me just point this out. This is sort of it's not a company. Patterns and Practices is almost like a network of some of the best SharePointers and Microsoft 365 experts around the globe. It's led by a chap called Vesa, and Vesa actually is a Microsoft employee. And there's other people from other companies. The second in command, I believe, is Owen Van Hunen from a company called Valo in Finland. And effectively, you've got all these experts around the world contributing to this open source code base. So what happens is every few months, just like Microsoft 365, the Patterns and Practices team provide an updated version of these modern search web parts. And of course, what I've done with my clients, for example, is when they've got them applied to production, every now and again, they have to apply the latest version. So there is a bit of background maintenance to make sure that they're updating to the latest version all the time, sometimes, to accommodate new features and functionality. But it works very well. No worries. Okay, let me skip back to the presentation. Bear with me. So hopefully that's useful to some of you. Now, the next thing I just wanted to mention is I'll skip back into another picture of the term store. And the reason I'm bringing this up is actually this isn't what your term store looks like. So you see down the left-hand side, you've got your managed metadata again. This is what it's going to look like. So the term store is the location inside the SharePoint Admin Center where your managed metadata lives and where it can be managed. And effectively what we're getting over the next few weeks, I believe, it could be as little as a fortnight away, is we're going to get this modern rebranded term store look and feel. Now, most of this is cosmetic. Most of this is giving it a fresh lick of paint, I'll admit, because frankly, the managed metadata service and the term store haven't really been updated in the last decade, and they were starting to look a bit ugly under the hood. So it's probably a long overdue lick of paint. But effectively, what you're getting here with the term store isn't just entirely a lick of paint. There's some new functionality coming as well. And one of the bits I'm excited by are some of the analytics that are being built into this new refreshed term store. So it promises, for example, to give you reports on who's using the terms and where they're being used, and which tags are being selected and where, which I think could be really powerful for people to take advantage of. Can't wait to play with it myself. It's not far away either. So quickly introduce content types as a concept. I'm sure many of you use content types. If we were talking 10 years ago, content types were the savior of everything and the best thing to use. There were lots of conversations about don't use folders, only use content types. So what is a content type? Well, effectively, it is a grouping of metadata to apply that grouping of metadata to a type of file. So you might need different metadata on different types of files. A good example might be, for example, a purchase order. If you had a purchase order, you might want, for example, a purchase order number to be applied to that purchase order. And you can imagine that you wouldn't want the purchase order number to be applied to another type of content. So what you do is you almost use content types a bit like a template. Bad analogy here of a little gingerbread man, but you see what I mean. It's effectively a way of using it almost as a cookie cutter to push out consistent metadata to specific types of files. And I guess for me, there was a bit of a conversation in the community. I don't know if any of you picked up on it, but a bit of a conversation about where are content types going? Are we going to get rid of content types? Effectively, the architecture of SharePoint Online almost sort of seemed to move away from them and make it easier for end users to almost add their own metadata on the fly whenever they wanted to. And I think the answer to that is an emphatic no. Here's a quote from Chris McNulty, who I'm sure some of you might be familiar with. He's a senior marketing manager for Microsoft, and he's often turns up at the big events and when Microsoft announce all these new products, etc. And Chris effectively is confirming that content types are essential to the vision. And I think if I move to the next slide, you'll see why. Just like we are getting a brand new lick of paint all over our term store for managed metadata, we're getting a brand new concept called the content type gallery that's coming out very soon. Now, behind the scenes, we've always had an ability to sort of push content types out through something called the content type hub. It's never been that effective, I'll be honest with you, but it's been a more of a developer space and something that most people didn't really play with. But the content type gallery that you actually get inside the new SharePoint Admin Center promises to be really powerful. The idea is that you can create centrally a series of content types and obviously associate columns of metadata with them, and then push those content types out from this central gallery to specific sites. And it's more of a push. The old school model was more of a pull. You'd have to sort of pull your content types down. In this instance, you can centrally manage them and push them out to the sites that you want them. So I'm really looking forward to playing with this. The content type gallery also suggests there's a few other sort of things that are coming, including the ability potentially in the future to start pushing content types not just to SharePoint sites, but to SharePoint hubs, meaning that you push it out to a single hub and it would sort of cascade down to all of the sites in that hub, which I think is incredibly powerful if that comes and is announced. So looking forward to that. I guess from my point of view, this is a big step forward, simply because certainly on recent projects that I've been working on, the best way of getting content types to be applied to multiple sites was almost to make sure that you wrote them as scripts and forced them to be deployed as identical content types to each individual site. And as you can imagine, that was time-consuming, laborious, and needed developers. In this content type gallery model, it threatens to actually give us an easy way to manage centrally all of the metadata and push it out where we need it. So fingers crossed, let's see what it looks like when we actually get to play with it. So moving on, effectively what I've covered already are some of the sort of basic constructs inside SharePoint Online that are available, and some things that are coming as well inside SharePoint Online that I think are going to make things better for everyone. I'm going to move on now to talking about the two types of labels that you might have heard spoken about in the community, just to give you a brief overview of both of them. Those are retention labels, and then following after that, I'll talk about sensitivity labels briefly, because both of these are relatively new forms of classification that are being provided not just within SharePoint Online, but more widely across Microsoft 365. So let's have a look at retention labels. Now, as might be indicated by their name, retention labels are all about records management. It's all about, I've got the torturous analogy here of sorting the wheat from the chaff. Effectively, you are trying to find all of that low value content and make sure it's deleted on a timely basis. And at the same time, you're trying to find the high value content and make sure it's preserved and retained. And as you can imagine, in my mind, retention labels should be something like this. They should be functional. And the reason I'm pointing this out is much of Microsoft's documentation doesn't show functional labels. When you're actually going through Microsoft's site, very often the examples they give you for retention labels are all security classifications, confidential, etc., which for me should never be part of the retention label story. So I'm not suggesting that you use engineering, environmental protection, etc., but to me, it's just to give you a flavor of the sorts of labels that I would expect to see being functional. So what's it for? Well, as you can imagine, it's to avoid being fined. It's for compliance with the regulations, and also to get rid of all that junk content, which really, from a user perspective, I think it's hard to underestimate how powerful it is to get rid of tons of rubbish, simply because having a good clean out in your file server and removing on a timely basis the things you really shouldn't be keeping helps significantly from an end user perspective when they're looking for valid and relevant content. So let's jump in a bit further. Let's have a quick look at what they actually do. Well, effectively, they can prevent the deletion of content when it's subject to retention. So if you try and as soon as a retention label is applied to any file, if you hit delete, it pops up a little message at the top of the screen saying, sorry, you can't delete this, it's subject to retention. They can also, of course, at the end of retention, invoke a series of actions. They're not every action you might want, but you've got the ability to automatically delete files. You've got the ability to undertake a content review, subject to a premium license, of course. And you've also got the ability, again, subject to a premium license, to make content immutable. So you can lock things down and actually prevent files from being modified at all. Interestingly, when you're applying a retention label to a list item, so in other words, just standard metadata, it locks down the metadata. But when you're applying a retention label to a document or an image or an asset that you've uploaded, effectively it locks down the actual change. It prevents changes to the item, but doesn't prevent changes to the metadata, which is a bit interesting. So just about how you push retention labels out effectively. Oh, just before I jump into this, I can hear the beep. I can hear another question. The question is, can I see all the files subject to particular retention label and apply bulk actions to review, dispose of those files in bulk? Oh, I wish we could. I really wish we could. There are gaps with retention labels. I'm not going to lie. I've spoken about this in other presentations. In fact, there was recently a big roundtable event that's now just, I'm going to upload it to YouTube in the next few days onto the IRMS's YouTube channel. I should select start live answer. But yeah, effectively, I've spoken about some of the gaps in retention labels, and unfortunately, there is no concept of aggregation around the disposal. In other words, with retention labels, if you make them subject to disposition review, you're in a situation where you've almost got to review each item individually, which makes them less than ideal in many ways. But it's still better than having nothing. I hope that sort of answers your question. Hop back into the slide deck. Right. Okay, good. Unfortunately, it probably wasn't the answer you wanted. Wish I had another monitor here so I could see everything all at once. But okay, so if we look at the retention labels, you can set up a whole bunch of them. Typically, organizations can go a bit crazy and set up far too many, if you ask me. But I think they work particularly well if you are quite selective about the labels that you're choosing to create. And the idea is that you create labels that sort of marry to your file plan. And against each of those labels, you can have both a duration and also an activity at the end of retention. Now, the thing to mention here is right at the bottom there, I've been a bit cheeky and suggested archival and permanent. Well, there isn't really an out-of-the-box activity at the end of retention for archival. That's almost got to be done manually at the moment. It's another one of those gaps. And when I mentioned the round table just a minute or two ago, effectively the event is, I was working with some of the other retention experts around the globe, and we were pulling together some of the national offices, the National Archives of the UK, National Archives of Scotland, the Norwegian equivalent body, as well as public records in New South Australia and in Victoria State in Australia, and pulling together all these national agencies and regulators. And effectively, the idea is to try and get all of us together with a shared voice, so that we've got a shared list of what we consider to be the most pressing issues around retention in Microsoft 365 that we can collectively take to Microsoft and see if we can actually get some action and some sort of traction, if you like, on filling some of those gaps. Because honestly, I think most organizations now, it's certainly a majority, are using Microsoft 365, and I think filling some of the gaps in the out-of-the-box functionality would be amazing for most organizations to really complete their compliance and retention. So you take your labels, and the way you push them out is you actually take individual labels and you push them into almost groups that are called label policies. And these groups, as you can imagine, have different labels in each group. So the idea is, effectively, instead of pushing all of your labels out everywhere across all of your content, you can take an individual group of labels and push that group of labels, the label policy, to a specific part of your tenancy. So you could, for example, in this instance, we pushed the projects group. We've pushed it both to one of our SharePoint sites and also to Outlook. So you've got quite a lot of flexibility in how you push labels out. And from a user perspective, that's great, because no one wants to be picking from an entire file plan of labels every time they need to classify something. Here, you're giving them a subset, and hopefully it's a contextual and relevant subset that you push to the relevant type of site. Of course, that means really you need to be aware of the types of site that you are having created and the types of ways that people are working in Microsoft 365, so that when new workspaces are created, you can associate them with relevant contextual labels. So Moving on to sensitivity labels. I don't know if any of you have come across sensitivity labels. I don't know if any of you are using sensitivity labels. I'd love to know. Well, I can hear a question just before I move into sensitivity labels. If oh, if only a few records admin users had E5 and normal end users had E3, this would allow central records management and allow the E3 users auto apply retention labels. Sort of, yes. There's recently been some licensing changes that the security and compliance team have pushed up onto the website, and unfortunately, when you start looking through them, they don't make great news. So it's always been the case that there's been a sort of grey area around the functionality that's been available to whom. It seems to now be pretty confirmed that what you need is any to use the advanced auto labeling of retention label features, and that's any of the auto labeling, whether we're talking about pattern matching, or whether we have talked about, for example, finding specific sort of credit card numbers and passport numbers, or there's a new concept where you can sort of use AI to start automatically classifying with retention labels, which is pretty cool. And of course, unfortunately, I'm now going to have to include in this the automatic application of labels through default folders. So setting default labels on libraries and folders is unfortunately now an E5 requirement. And what this means is to be able to use any of the auto application features, any user who can edit a specific file that has had its retention label automatically applied to it, you need an E5 or equivalent premium license, because there's other bolt-ons, etc., for every user who has edit rights on the files that have had automatic retention labels applied to them. I know it's a long-winded answer. It's not a great answer as well, simply because it's a bit disappointing. Hence the sort of round table we had the other week to try and at least get more functionality out of the out-of-the-box features. I can see that a couple of people have responded to say that they've actually started looking at assigning sensitivity labels. So let's hop straight back over to the slides and have a look at that. So sensitivity labels, for those of you who haven't encountered sensitivity labels before, effectively this is far more on the information security side of things, but I think there's still a valid classification to look at. So really, when you're applying a sensitivity label to a file, you're imposing controls over the use of that sensitive content. You're really sort of restricting how people use the content. And coming soon, you're getting the ability to, it's certainly been announced, I haven't seen it yet, it might well be out, things drip out into different tenancies at different time, but the ability to apply data loss prevention via sensitivity labels. And that's going to massively increase the value I think you get from your sensitivity labels. We'll come on to that in a second. So I think it's fairly clear what a sensitivity label should look like. Something like this. It's not a retention label. As I said before, Microsoft's documentation often confuses them as far as I can see in the example labels they give. But for me, sensitivity labels very much around the way you are classifying things from a security point of view. So the benefits. Clearly, the first one, if you're using sensitivity labels today, it's all around controlling what people can do with your content. Whereas as soon as DLP is available with sensitivity labels, by the way, DLP, data loss prevention, is already available. You just can't yet apply it through sensitivity labels. You can apply it through managed metadata. You can even apply it through retention labels. Why you'd ever want to do that, I have no idea. What you can't do yet, and it's coming soon, is map it to sensitivity labels where it really should be housed. Anyway, when DLP is applied, it's also around data leaks. So you are massively reducing the probability that sensitive information accidentally leaks. And basically, if you start seeing that sensitive information has leaked, you can almost guarantee that it's malicious instead of accidental because of the DLP features. So when I mentioned control, I was a bit wishy-washy, I guess, in terms of what I meant. So let's just go through some of those controls. Firstly, you're marking the file. You actually see sensitivity marked on the file, both in terms of the two red areas that you can see at the top and tail of the document, but also the great big watermark that you can see applied across the file. And obviously all of this is configurable, but you get the idea. The idea is that you can actually physically mark that file as being of a relevant classification. It also provides you the ability to encrypt documents and emails. Now, the encryption options that are provided, they've improved significantly. There's various sort of, you might Google and encounter blog posts saying that there's a few issues with them. The biggest issue that used to exist was that search couldn't open up anything you encrypted, which was quite a big problem. Thankfully, Microsoft 365 has got around that problem. Encrypted documents now can be fully searched. But really what you're looking at here, the only thing to mention, I guess, is if when you've encrypted something, it takes a little bit of time to encrypt and decrypt. So everything is a little bit slower when you're working with encrypted files. It's not catastrophic, it's not very slow, it's just a little bit slower. Add a few seconds to every operation. I did notice a question behind the scenes. Please remind people that this only applies to Microsoft native files and nothing else. Yes, of course, you're talking about sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels only apply to the Office suite. You're quite right. Let's hop back in. Effectively, a sensitivity label is almost embedded actually into the file itself. And so it doesn't work with all of the different files that you might upload into Microsoft 365, but it's still a very powerful way of extending controls onto the content that you've got in Microsoft 365. So if you do choose to encrypt your documents and emails, you can actually then impose rules upon how specific groups of people work with those files. So you can perhaps prevent a certain group of people from editing a certain type of file that's got a certain sensitivity label. You can prevent saves, or, I'm not going to read the whole list, but you can imagine how powerful it would be to have the ability to prevent certain groups of people from even being able to print or forward emails. Now this, because the sensitivity label persists with the file and isn't part really of SharePoint or Microsoft 365, it's part of Office, it means that the sensitivity label applies your controls wherever the file ends up. So if that file ends up in a different organization, you can still have your rules kicking in to prevent them from forwarding, printing, all the rest of it, copying, even as you can see, to a certain extent, preventing screen capture. So there's a lot of things that sensitivity labels can do to really secure and protect your content, even after it's left your organization. Let's just run through some of these quickly. Bear with me. So you can set automated content expiry. This is fine, but I don't think it's actually that useful, I'll be honest with you. This could be useful for things such as contracts or sales proposals, for example, that you don't want to persist forever because they're time limited. I've never really found a good use for this, but it could be useful in some scenarios. And likewise, you can you can sort of determine that people have regularly check in offline. I guess the scenario that this sort of prevents is someone taking your content and then only using it offline, because this forces them to keep checking back in and authorizing to check that they're still a valid user. So it's quite useful from that perspective. Now, I mentioned data loss prevention before. I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail here, but effectively, once this is and something that can be sort of invoked from the sensitivity label, and at the moment there's a whole range of ways you can apply data loss prevention but not sensitivity labels. Once it is something that can be part of the sensitivity label, it basically stops your sensitive content from getting into the wrong hands in the first place. So you can almost imagine the data loss prevention acting almost like a barrier, and that barrier prevents any information that it doesn't want to be exposed to certain groups of people from actually even leaving the organization, let's say, in the first place. By itself, and certainly the way that it's configured out of the box, I don't think it's amazing, because the problem you've got most of the time is how on earth do you get data loss prevention onto the content? But I think once it's in conjunction with sensitivity labels, there's going to be a lot of value in applying both of them together. Now, data loss prevention does slightly different things depending on where it's applied in the tenant. And I hate going into licensing questions, but last time I looked, which was only a few months ago, honest, the licenses were E3 and E5, respectively, for the SharePoint OneDrive and Exchange Rule E3 for data loss prevention, and Teams was E5. That might well have changed. I haven't looked in the last few weeks, and there have been some serious changes, so take that with a pinch of salt. But effectively, what you can do with data loss prevention depends on the application you're in. So in the context of OneDrive and SharePoint, it blocks sharing altogether. So you can almost prevent people sharing specific files that are marked as sensitive with specific audiences, which is really powerful. Within Exchange, again, you can prevent emails. You can, if someone attaches, let's say, a sensitive file and tries to send it to an external email address, you can prevent that altogether, or you can pop up a message and say, "Are you sure?" Because effectively, you've got a bit of control over how that's managed using data loss prevention. It doesn't have to be a hard yes, no. You've got an option of allowing people to override themselves if they wish to. You can also send encrypted emails. That's a little bit more convoluted than it might sound, but it's very good if you really want to make sure that people can't hack into your emails when they're in transit. And in terms of Teams, Teams is a bit more complicated. Effectively, the E5 features are for the chat and channels in Teams, and this is because they are effectively AI driven. And it's all about the advanced sort of pattern matching. I'm talking about things such as credit cards and Japanese passport numbers, and regular patterns that it can identify. If you post something that's basically forbidden by your data loss prevention into chat or channel messages, something sensitive like a credit card number, it would automatically be blocked with the E5 features. But that's not to say that everything in Teams requires E5, simply because, of course, the files behind your Teams are stored in SharePoint. So, of course, the ability to block people sharing files with the wrong audience would be covered by the data loss prevention from the sort of standard license. Again, all with a pinch of salt in. I haven't actually checked the licensing of this in the last couple of weeks, and they change so fast. Okay, so one of the major differences with all of the other types of classification that we've spoken about previously is effectively that you apply sensitivity labels in the file itself. So you can imagine in a Word document, or in this case an email, you're actually able to tag things with the sensitivity that you want to apply to the particular file or the type of content. Now, as you can imagine, manual classification only gets you so far, but there's two ways of applying this. You either have the automated application, again with a more advanced license, which looks for exact phrases like policy document, and again it's going to tag everything that it finds with that exact phrase in it, so it's got to be specific enough to be unique to the type of file that you're looking for, and as you can imagine, that's quite difficult to actually find a good exact phrase that both covers everything and doesn't include things accidentally. And like the other option there for automated is sensitive information types, like for example the credit card numbers, etc. we've been mentioning. And of course, if you don't happen to be lucky enough to have a premium license, because it's not just E5, there's a whole range of other premium licenses that you can have. It's easier to classify it as generally E5. If you're not lucky enough to have a premium license, then effectively, unfortunately, it's manual tagging on an item by item basis, which, as we all know, is going to happen pretty inconsistently. But certainly, where you've got tightly controlled processes, things, for example, like legal cases, I can imagine situations where people would very actively make sure that the correct sensitivity label is being applied to the correct file. It's probably going to happen far less in day-to-day work in generic scenarios. Got another question I'll quickly hop into. So yeah, unified labeling, interesting one. So effectively, yeah, the sensitivity labels are really part of the unified labeling story. It's a little bit confusing, I know. Effectively, sensitivity labels really under the hood are called something called a zero information protection. And when you create a sensitivity label, it's actually creating an AIP label. But yeah, sensitivity labels are one of the core components alongside retention labels of the unified labeling story. I'm going to move on from that question, but hopefully that's given you a reasonable answer at least. Let's hop back in. Okie dokie. So sensitivity labels, I'll brush through this quite quickly. A bit like retention labels, you can create a whole series of different labels and classifications, typically a lot less than you would create in the scenario of retention. And exactly in the same way that you would for a retention label, I'm not going to make you watch the whole animation, but you can imagine each sensitivity label then gets pushed out into certain groups. But the difference is fundamentally that when you then associate those groups, you're not pushing them to structural units. You're not pushing them to, let's say, everyone's entire inbox, or you're not pushing it to you're not pushing it to, let's say, an entire site or the entirety of an inbox. You are making them available to specific users. So you target, let's say, sensitivity labels at either individual users or groups of users, which can be quite interesting. It's a different way of thinking about things, and I can give you some examples. Imagine you have, I don't know, some users who are involved in scientific research or something. You might well need to give them a whole bunch of different sensitivity labels just for that team or just for that group of users that are then available to the rest of the organization. Certainly, I can imagine senior management might need different sensitivity labels too. Anyway. Changing subject again. So third major shift altogether in this presentation. And to me, this is the most exciting part possibly, because this is really the future. I don't know how many of you have heard of Project Cortex. I'm imagining that many of you have started to hear about it on the grapevine already. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you're going to have to get used to a new name, because what we call Project Cortex in 2 weeks' time is going to get a different name, and we don't know what it's going to be. So we'll all start referring to this brand new thing in the middle of July, and yeah, it's going to be exciting. Because of course, what we know about Project Cortex already is, I think it's going to be one of the most revolutionary, I guess, pieces of the technology and it's specifically in this area of knowledge and information management. So really, it's got two major sort of streams related to it. You've got a whole bunch of functions around building an internal knowledge network, really getting more value from your existing content. And you've got a second stream of related functions that basically are all around automatic application of classification. And I'll just give you an overview of some of these right now. So I've jumped into Wikipedia, and that might surprise some of you because Wikipedia has absolutely nothing to do with Project Cortex, but it's probably the best analogy I've got for the knowledge network side of Project Cortex. You see, what we're looking at is the Wikipedia page for vehicles. And you can see I'm hovering over the train's Wikipedia page, and you're seeing a little card pop up with knowledge about that train. And you can imagine that there's a relationship between vehicles and trains, and that's effectively how Wikipedia works. I mean, I don't know if perhaps it's just me, but I've spent hours accidentally over the years clicking on links and find myself coming up against the strangest Wikipedia pages and learning all sorts of obscure things, and you can't even remember where you started from. But it probably is just me. It probably explains an awful lot about me, actually. But this really is very similar to the knowledge network that is being built inside Cortex. So when you think about a knowledge network, imagine that you've got all of your corporate data, and imagine that some of it is still related to vehicles. But that corporate data, the files, the bits of information that you've got floating around in Microsoft 365 and wider than Microsoft 365, because you've got the ability to build connectors to start extend Cortex out into other data sets as well. And there's various connectors that come out of the box. But you've got this ability to sort of, for the AI to search across all of your content and start finding patterns, start sort of building almost an extra layer of knowledge over the top of your existing content. So you can imagine that this is going to provide an extra layer. It's a supplementary service. I think many people, when they start reading or thinking about Cortex, will start almost seeing it as a shortcut, or seeing it as a way that they can avoid doing all the hard work of classification and getting the metadata structures right in the first place, and physically getting the structures together that make sense for people to navigate. It's not. Really, this side of Cortex is all about finding all of that information and providing an alternative way of traversing it, and an alternative way of deriving value. And you can imagine that when you start looking across different types of information that you're going to have inside an organization, there's going to be different types of information. So some of these are going to be people, for example. These could be project managers who are working on a specific topic or specific theme. And some of them are going to be locations. It could well be, I think the example I think Microsoft used were oil wells or something. You can imagine the type of organization you are, you might have whole bunches of different types of information that all relate together and together provide sort of really valuable knowledge that would help different people inside that organization, inside your organization, learn about other concepts. I think here's Microsoft's example. So they got this, just play forever this slide, but effectively they've got this Project Core. And you can see why I hope you can see why I used the Wikipedia example. The idea is almost, we're on just a web page. That hyperlink under core and under Mark 8 and SOAR as well on this page, those hyperlinks have not been added to the page. The AI has almost imposed them over the top of the page. So it has found, it's scanned the page, it's understood the content to, by itself, and it's basically determined that core is something of value. And core, it has assembled something called a topic, this constructions operations reliability panel, and that topic is stored in the knowledge center. This is the knowledge center is a brand new SharePoint site that's coming out fairly soon. And the idea here of this topic is you are batching together relevant related information about that project or about that topic. And of course, the topic could be almost anything. The topic could be, something simple like a project, or it could be related to something more fundamental to the way your organization works. But it's going to vary from organization to organization. It's all going to depend upon the way you work and your existing content. But very much the idea is it's providing people who don't know about that almost with a quick starting point. So imagine you're a joiner to this organization. You would be able to just quickly pick up many of the internal sort of language. As a consultant, every organization I walk into has a different way of communicating in a different language. And frankly, I think this could be really useful for many people who are new to an organization to understand conversations and know what people are talking about without having to ask questions all the time. But also more widely than that, for other types of employees who are already very familiar with the way the organization works. I think the way that this sort of materializes in lots of different places, whether you're talking about emails or Word documents or web pages, and you're still going to be able to find all of the relevant information around a given topic and bounce from that topic to other topics and see the people that are related to that topic, etc. I think that's going to give value not just for new joiners, but for people who perhaps didn't work on that initiative or would like to learn more. So I think the real value from this side, the knowledge side of Cortex, is going to be in sort of the insights that it derives and the sort of a hidden value of the way that people can find out more almost by osmosis and learn about their organization. There's going to be a lot less, I guess, reinventing the wheel once Cortex starts running. Now, all of these topics that you're seeing here, I think there's a natural fear that many people in the knowledge and information management community have when they start hearing about automatic AI coming along and starting to build knowledge networks and stuff. To me, it's really exciting, but I don't think you need to be scared of this. This certainly isn't something that I think is going to, replace knowledge and information management staff. In fact, quite the opposite. I think there's going to be a whole new responsibility here for people working alongside the capabilities of this knowledge network. I'm going to use a whole series of laborious sort of agricultural references, but I think firstly, you're going to need to help seed topics. There's going to be gaps. AI is not going to get everything perfect. I think starting off with a decent seed is going to be a really valuable thing to do. You're then going to need to sort of cultivate. You're going to have to add additional information to topics. You're going to have to start, making sure that perhaps even integrating other systems in. I could see topics potentially starting to integrate in the future with, for example, information that's stored in other systems like Dynamics, or perhaps even pulling information from Power BI all into one sort of interface. It could be incredibly powerful. Imagine you're looking at the topics that relate to your customers and you're starting to see, I don't know, recent sales reports. It really depends on the industry you're in, but you can see where I'm going. And lastly, I think there's going to be a lot of pruning that's needed. I know it's a torturous analogy, but there's going to be topics that really shouldn't be topics. It doesn't matter how good people say the AI is going to be. I think it's going to take a bit of planning and a bit of a careful curation. But effectively, it is human assistance of the AI, and I think you're going to get great value from it for anyone who's lucky enough to be able to use Cortex. Here's a picture of the Knowledge Center. You can see lots of different topics. I'm not going to dive into this particularly, but this really will be the zone that people in knowledge and information management will start curating the Knowledge Center itself, and creating all of the different topics that you can see and starting to help the AI wire them all together and complete the gaps, etc. Now, not going to dwell on this too much, but the other side of this is a bad slide, I know, but I didn't have time. The other side of Project Cortex really is the metadata extraction and automatic classification. And really, there's two sides to this. You've got some powerful capabilities coming with something called AI Builder, which is really going to be great for the sort of structured file that you're seeing here. You know, anything that is a regular structure, that is, especially anything that is a physical file that's been scanned in, being able to consistently scan and upload, extract metadata from files like this, I think could be incredibly valuable. You know, for example, if you can get the metadata, for example, the total out of all your purchase orders, it's going to be incredibly powerful because you can start totaling the totals and doing all sorts of fun things with them, and undertaking analytics too. Now, some of you probably already have other products that do this. There's other products that exist on the market, for example, Kofax, and I'm going to butcher the name, Finestra, for example. I think it is in Holland, but there's various other products that already do this. I just think it's good that some of these capabilities are being brought into Microsoft 365. But the innocuous word there, machine teaching, that I really need to pad out with a better slide. But the machine teaching side here, I think, is incredibly powerful. This is diving into Azure Cognitive Services, for want of a better word. It's going into the real back-end power of the AI capabilities of Microsoft 365. And what it's going to do is you train the AI to start finding the relevant metadata that you want to find in unstructured files, completely unstructured files. So imagine you have a whole series of, let's say, contracts, and you've got hundreds of contracts in your organization, and each contract has a specific date in it, the contract start date, let's say, you're looking for. Somewhere buried in the documents, on one file it might be on page 4, on one file it might be on page 400. The ability to use AI to start finding it, even if perhaps in one file it says signatory date, and another file it says date of contract, another it says contract date, being able to extract the relevant date consistently from similar files, I think would be incredibly powerful. And effectively, that's what this machine teaching is promising. Once you've got large data sets of related sort of files that are unstructured, you will be able to sort of train the AI, teach the AI to extract the metadata that you want. And once I've not played with it, I can't wait to play myself with this particular bit of functionality. In theory, you know, that I want to challenge it. I want to play with things such as trying to, you know, give it files that have lots and lots of dates and see if it can find the correct date, so it's not matching the incorrect ones. I want to see how far I can push this technology, simply because as soon as I can work that out, I can share that with everyone else. But the benefits here, as you can imagine, are significant. The other thing I should mention really is that Project Cortex is the first step down this road. It's the biggest single investment that Microsoft's put into Microsoft 365 since Teams. You know, this is a huge undertaking, and there will be trumpets played in a couple of weeks' time when it's announced. But it's, to me, it's not going to be the finished product on day one. Over the next 5 years or so, I'm imagining this is going to continuously improve and continuously evolve, and you're going to see something, I think, that could be quite powerful for the whole of the information management community when it starts to mature. And I guess bringing you back to the Clovis points and a word of warning. And the reason I'm doing this is effectively because I just wanted to show you what AI can do, and also what AI perhaps cannot do. So if anyone's played with Microsoft 365 and uploaded images recently, you might have seen that Microsoft 365 attempts to apply alt tags to images automatically. So feel free to use the questions if you want, but can anyone guess what happened when I uploaded this image into Microsoft 365? What alternative text did it decide to grant to this image? Any suggestions? Well, I personally thought it might look a bit like surfboards or shark's teeth or something like that. Wind socks. That's an interesting one. I like that. Wind socks. Any others? Well, the answer is a bunch of hot dogs. As you can see, AI doesn't always get it right. And I thought, I'd take the same image. I'll upload it again, see what happens on a white background. Any suggestions on a white background? I won't wait for you to post them all. What it came back with made me laugh, so I thought I'd share it with you. Suggested alternative text is a hot dog covered in snow. I don't know. Anyway, I hope that you've had some value from this talk. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm happy for you to all reach out at any point, either through my intelogy email address or digital director at IRMS, and bounce any questions off me. I'll stay on the call if there are any questions for a few minutes. Cuttlefish, yeah, they do look like cuttlefish. That's a good suggestion. Anyone with any questions? Do feel free to contact me at any stage. Otherwise, I will wrap up the presentation. Well, thank you very much for all attending. Thank you. Hi, Liz.
Oh, hi, Rob, and hi, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming along. Actually, I had problems with my bandwidth for the camera, so I've just worked that out. What a fantastic presentation that was, Rob, really brilliant. And on behalf of the IRMS Ireland Group, thank you very much. Really enlightening. The introduction that I would have had before Rob started was to welcome you all, of course, both our members and our non-members. And also just to thank Rob for for doing the presentation this evening. Rob has contributed so much to the RMS. He is on the exec as digital director on the RMS executive, which is a big role, and he's got huge demands on him. And yet he's able to calmly actually just go into that presentation when I was having technical difficulties. So thank you so much, Rob, for that. And also to the RMS executive who've arranged for our groups to host webinars on Livestorm. Special thanks again to Robert in relation to that, because obviously you've had a big role in that.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honour actually to be able to speak to you all, and then a privilege as well. So thank you.
And hopefully, Rob, we will see you at one of our events in Ireland. We have got the 8th of October penciled in. I'm not for an event in Dublin, but I'm not sure that'll go ahead. Our venue hosts are actually holding the date for us, but I think we'll probably stick with webinars for now. We'll see how it goes in a couple of months. With the pandemic, everything changes so quickly. So hopefully they'll come up with a vaccine soon enough.
Well, fingers crossed, eh? It's been 20 years since I was last in Dublin, so I'd love to come across at some point. But yeah, just hope everyone stays well.
I mean. And also, we were supposed to have a great event up in Prony in Belfast in June, along with our ARA Ireland group, and also I think the ARA Records Management Group from the UK were going to be involved in that. So that's an annual training day we normally run alongside along with the Archives and Records Association. So we definitely, if we don't have an event this year, we definitely will have one next year. And just for the participants, this was a fantastic presentation, and also to see a little bit more about Rob, if you go onto the RMS website and look at our conference information, and you'll see Rob is going to be speaking at the conference as well on Teams. I think it is, Rob, isn't it? Teams?
Yes. I booked to speak on governance within Teams. I've already actually got a recording of that up on the RMS's YouTube channel that I did the other week. But I think I might have to revise it before conference, otherwise people get bored.
Yeah, and that's a huge area. I did watch that on the YouTube channel, and it's a fantastic presentation, because that's a huge deal at the moment. I know even in my own organisation, we're looking at Teams and, of course, the governance surrounding Teams as well, because you have to be so careful now with sharing that it's only going and seen by the people who need to see it. So and so I had initially thought we'd have a poll on members or not, but we won't at this point. We can dispense with that. So if anybody has any other questions, you know, or anything else that they'd like to share with the group in relation to it, do feel free to do that. Just to let you know, also, one of the things I would have been saying, housekeeping-wise, at the beginning, was that we don't store information on our individual participants on this live storm website. So just to let you know that. So if you are a member, that's wonderful, great. You already know the benefits. For anybody who's attending this evening who are not members, please do consider joining as an individual, or indeed get your organisation to join as a corporate member. And you'll see all those details again on irms.org.uk. The IRMS is a fantastic resource for all your information management professionals. And indeed, it's actually for all people who manage information, which these days is just about everybody, I think. You know, everybody's managing information at one level or another. And now we can all access, you know, Microsoft Teams, and we can easily get onto these platforms and get them running in whatever environment we're working in. Maybe it's a voluntary organisation, or you know, a government body, but it's just the governance aspect, which is Rob's focus there, is so important. And you know, I love the classification idea, because that's, I've been saying that for years on end, how important it is to have your classification in place, so that you can actually manage your information properly. And of course, that is so important with the data protection legislation, etc., that again, you have to have your classifications to have a retention schedule. Once you apply your retention schedule to it, at least then you have a time frame for how long you're going to hold information and what you're going to do with it at the end of the period, the current period for that information. So if anybody has any proposals for any future events, or if they've any interest in a particular subject area, please do let me know, ireland@irms.org.uk, and we'll take it from there. Our committee is very active. We do have we do try to progress any queries or any current events for the membership generally. So do let us know, and do keep in touch, especially now with COVID. I think we're all working from home, and if you haven't already attended Ren and Scott's pub quiz, I would encourage you to do so. It's a great little event. They were running it every 2 weeks, up to, I think, about maybe 2 or 3 weeks, 2 weeks ago maybe, and they'll be running another one now in a couple of weeks' time. Again, they're in the events section of the website. And as regards the resources, you can access a lot of the information. This presentation by Rob will be available and accessible to you on Livestorm for the next 2 weeks, and we'll take it from there then, if it's to go on the on our YouTube channel then, Rob. So has anybody else any feedback or anything else to contribute? Okay, so in that case, we'll end the webinar now. Just like to once again thank Rob for giving his time for this session, and also for all the work he does as Digital Director on the IRMS Executive. So thanks again, Rob, and thanks everybody for coming along this evening.
Yeah, thanks all for showing up and listening to me so late at night as well. Cheers all.